Howdy, and welcome back to my channel, which has now been renamed to match my Instagram and my Tumblr after many complaints from people, including some mildly embarrassing family members, that they just couldn't find me. In my previous video, I went over the process of drafting and testing this corset pattern into a proper and comfortable shape. Now it's time to do all of those fancy-dancy, professional-looking Victorian techniques that I've been drooling over that were featured so heavily during this period. Oh, that is right after I finished making adjustments to my pattern. In general, I had to add 3 inches as a whole to the waist and 2 inches to the hips. So I added 1/2 inch bits at strategic spots at the waist and 1/4 inches to strategic spots at the hips, and then adjusted the slope of my rib cage to bust curve just a little bit. You might also note my improved video quality. I upgraded my camera to something that shoots in 1080p and 4K, and watched a lot of COVID stuff while that was going on about improving your angles and your video quality, and I feel like I know a little bit more now at least. I'm still experimenting, and you can see that roughly half of this video is a little overexposed as I was still messing with the lighting and f-stop and all that control while I was working on this. And you might notice that I'm mocking the cording channels while I'm doing this. Those aren't actually for genuine reference as to where to sew my channels, as I do that on the fly as I'm actually putting them in. It's actually so that I can adjust the angles and make sure things line up and are symmetrical. They're not the exact boning channels. It's generally either the top channel or the bottom channel, and then I just fill in with the right amount of lines for the number of cording channels that I wanted. I made this corset, unlike the other one, which was made out of home decor cotton, out of a double herringbone twill. The difference between herringbone twill and genuine coutil is a mystery to me. I assume that it's just not marketed for corsets, but it feels like a very good coutil, so I'm pretty happy with what I chose. However, like my mock-up, I am using the technique of cutting out my strength layer to the exact measurements that I want, and then cutting the pieces of the outside weaker fashion fabric a little bit bigger so that I allow room for it to shrink with the piping. And the key to cutting out a corset so that it behaves properly is to cut the back lacing panels and the front panel where the busk is inserted on the straight grain, and to cut everything else out ever so slightly on the bias so they have that little bit of stretch to them. And the outside pretty layer of this corset is made out of this gorgeous floral quilting cotton. They only sold it in fat quarters at Joann's, so I ended up getting 3 fat quarters of it, which I knew was should be plenty, and then I forgot to flip pieces over while I was cutting them out and ended up nearly running out of fabric anyway, and some of the pieces are a little bit tight. In terms of assembly, step 1 is to insert the busk and get that all stitched in there. This is because there's a bunch of cording that touches the busk, and obviously I want the cording inserted before I sew the panels together. So I have to do that first, and the way I do this is pretty typical, although I do add an extra step of going in with both a tiny stitch and a little bit larger stitch when I'm installing the busk where all my stitching is going to be in order to make it just a little bit more secure. If you've never installed a busk before, this part is fairly straightforward. You just leave gaps in your stitching every so often in order to leave room for your loops, and then sew all the way straight across the side that is going to hold your pegs, or those little things that you stick the loops onto. Once you've got your stitches made, you can install the actual busk. You insert the loops through one side, through the little slits that you left in your front on the one side, and then the pegs get inserted via just shoving them through holes that you make with an awl. And definitely make sure you use an awl or even a knitting needle or something for when you insert your pegs rather than cutting a hole, because it will be a detriment to the fabric if you poke your holes through with an awl. For a long time I did this with a knitting needle. Once one of these pieces are in, pin as close as you possibly can to the edge of the metal itself, as this will allow you to get that little bit closer when you're stitching in the busk. You can stitch in the busk by hand with back stitches, or you can use a zipper foot on your sewing machine. And even then, you wouldn't necessarily need a zipper foot, it just makes things much easier, and if you're not using a zipper foot, it's difficult to get close enough to put the tension on the busk that should be there. So definitely suggest getting a zipper foot or back stitching it in by hand, even if you don't do anything else by hand. I also did up the center back where the back lacing channels will be, so that I would be able to turn that over. I chose to do channels in the actual fabric for this rather than separate boning channels, because the boning channels that I had just were a little bit too wide, because I used 1/4 inch flat steels at the center back, because otherwise it would have just collapsed under the weight of my sway back. Then I used a water-soluble marking pen and my pattern for lots and lots of reference in order to mark all of my future boning channels that weren't on a seam, as well as all of my cording channels. And I'm only marking 1 cording channel on each panel, because you really don't need more than that, because your boning channels are going to vary a little bit with each one that you put in, because you're not really gonna follow each of those boning channels, especially when you physically can't. as is the case with those angled cording channels that touch the center busk. And I found that working from the top down was the best strategy for those, because then at least I could make sure that the top lined up, which made things look more symmetrical than when I started from the bottom, because every boning channel ends up being a little bit different, especially when you're just shoving them in there and using your fingernails and a zipper foot to get them as close as possible to each other. According to a bunch of ready-to-wear corset advertisements from the time period, that chevron at the front is called a corded bust, and I saw it a lot, especially on ready-to-wear corsets of the period. Depending on how intense the angle of your chevron is, you might be able to shove all of your cording in with your fingernails or with your hands. However, if it's a little bit too dramatic for that, you can also use such techniques as a mechanical pencil, including the lead, in order to get a better angle and get it further up into that V shape. However, if you're not working on a V-shaped panel, you can potentially just sew your channels and then run it through with like a really big needle or a safety pin, but I don't like doing that because it means that you have to make your boning channel wide enough for not only the cord itself, but also to get the cord and the needle and a second portion of the cord through, because it has to double back on itself in order to stay on the needle. Once all your cording has been inserted, you can start trimming down your pieces to match the size and shape that they are supposed to be when you didn't leave any extra room. Once all of your pieces have been cut down to size, you can start sewing them together. And I would recommend giving a special focus to anything with a chevron corded busk, because you want those to line up as well as you possibly can, but if you must sacrifice one line being slightly not correct, make sure the top lines up properly, and people will just forget about the bottom. But if the bottom lines up properly, people are still going to be focused on the top. Unlike most garments, you generally sew a corset together with the fashion layers outward and the strength layers inward, because what we're going to do, I'm also not going over this twice, because the boning channels are going to go over top of that seam allowance and take almost all of the pressure off of the actual seam itself. So I'm just using teeny tiny stitches. And once everything is together, you can insert your waist tape, which I am doing from the corset side of the lacing panels to the inside of the busk, and then you just secure it at every seam with either back stitches stitching in the ditch, or you could also do this on a machine with teeny tiny little stitches. You're also going to mow over them with the boning channels later. This just reinforces your waist a little bit and keeps the corset from stretching out at its most high tension point. I am going to say it right now, pinning and sewing over those chevroned channels where where it meets as cording on both sides is really, really hard. Just trim it down as short as you possibly can. Try and trim into the cord so that you get a little bit less struggle when it's involved, and just do your best. Try and cover it all. I don't think that's ever going to be perfect. I also sewed a little bit of this lace that's been hiding in my stash for a long time to the top. This was very common, both in ready-to-wear and couture corsets, I noticed. This boning that I'm using right here is synthetic whalebone, not steel, and not featherlight. The synthetic whalebone can be steamed into the correct shape and leads to a much more authentically Victorian silhouette, because it doesn't hold a solid shape like steel does. The final step on my machine was to bind the top and bottom edges of the corset, because those are still left unfinished. And to do that, I'm just using a little bit of bias binding. And pro tip, start from the back and not the front if you're doing it by machine. But if you want to look really fancy-dancy A+ sharp, you can do it from the front like I'm showing here, but then finish the back by whip stitching it in by hand, or slip stitching it, whichever you prefer. Doing it by machine means that you will have visible top stitching on at least one side, and you generally prefer it not to be the side that you are showing off to the world. Generally, you want to have that on the inside. I just have goldfish brain. Here I also chose to install a little drawstring just at the front where the bust is. For this, it helps a lot with the chest shelf that you sometimes get at the top of a corset. Because everything is already stitched together, if you don't want it to show onto the top side, you have to stitch it in by hand, and I'm just doing this with some messy whip stitches. As you actually go through, when you get to the end of the channel though, make sure you're sewing through the end of your drawstring, mine's just a little bit of ribbon, several times to make sure that you're actually catching that and that you're not going to end up with a drawstring that just pulls right out and having to redo the whole thing. Then one more step and my corset was wearable. I inserted some grommets. You can use 2-part eyelets, or grommets is what I usually suggest. And I'm not showing the process of me punching the holes. You can use just a general die punch, but I bought mine from Harbor Freight, so it wasn't sharp enough and my holes were really ugly and it didn't work that well, which is why you don't get to see any of the footage, because it wasn't pretty. This is what I get for going to Harbor Freight for it. My last step was cording. Cording isn't absolutely necessary in a corset, but it adds a nice finishing little touch and detail, and I like the way it looks, and it also adds the extra stability of keeping your bones exactly where you want them to be. And you can actually do this on off-the-rack corsets. Your corset doesn't need to be prepared in any special way, it just needs bones that don't touch your binding. That's all it requires. I went into doing my flossing with absolutely no plan and no experience, and I think these turned out okay. They're just some simple V-X shapes in some contrasting colors. I used a slightly different pattern on the boning channels at the very back where my lacing panels is, just because I figured I would, because it was already going to be in different colors, and you can't really see it as well on that one because it's among all the floss, but I did experiment with 2 different designs. That's another thing, you can take these out and replace them with different stitching, and it really doesn't hurt your corset that much. It's a very impermanent modification that's pretty helpful, I would say. Then lace up your corset. You might notice that I'm using paracord here and ribbon in my final photos. I didn't like the way the paracord looked. It was quite bulky even when it was tucked away into itself. So I just decided to do ribbon instead, and I just used some grosgrain ribbon. I just didn't film the version of me putting the pink ribbons in because I was in a rush on that day, because I meant to do it the day before, but then I didn't, because instead of doing that, I thought I would cut my hair, because that's what life is like when you have body modifications. You just, occasionally you get a wild hair and you're like, I gotta do something dramatic right now. And then, holy crap, my corset was complete. Overall, this is very similar to what I had in my mind when I started on this project, which is incredibly rare and doesn't happen very often, and it gives almost exactly the silhouette I was looking for. Although I will admit that I did kind of reinvent the wheel, because looking at Aspend corset patterns, like Edwardian corsets, it is almost exactly the same pattern. I could have just copied one of them, except for the back of the hips, because Edwardian Aspends were made with a lot of padding at the hips. My final test was corset versus lightweight knit sweater, and I think this has more to do with the knit sticking to the lace than to the chest shelf. So I think I achieved my goal, I just didn't think about the lace. Or if you're feeling particularly spicy and want to show off your corset, you can wear it with a see-through chiffon shirt that I thrifted and have not worn since because I can't find a way to wear it that I like, although I quite like this one, although I'm torn as to whether it looks good or whether I just look like an emo kid. Either way, like this video if you liked this video. Consider subscribing for more vaguely historically inspired flounderings. You can also follow me on Instagram and consider joining my Discord server, which isn't just for sewists, it's also for all types of artists. And I will see you again very soon.